Don't put your hands on him. The man said it before anyone had even moved toward the dog. Piper Dunne had been in the middle of updating a chart at the side counter when the waiting room door banged open at 11:47 on a Tuesday night, and she looked up not because of the sound. Doors banged open constantly at Eastfield Emergency Animal Care. That was just the nature of the place, but because of what came through it. A Belgian Malinois, limping badly on the left hind leg, fur matted dark along the ribcage, trailing a leather leash held tight in the hand of a man in a gray Army PT shirt and cargo pants, who moved like he expected the room to reorganize itself around him. He wasn't yelling. He didn't need to. The voice came out level and absolute, the kind of tone that had stopped privates cold in their tracks for probably 20 years. He's a military working dog. He doesn't know you. Don't approach him. Clem, who had been walking toward them with the standard intake clipboard, slowed and looked at Piper. Piper looked at the dog. The Malinois was holding himself up on 3 legs. His head was low, ears halfway back, but his eyes were scanning the room with a measured alertness that wasn't panic. It was assessment. He was in pain and he was working through it. There was a familiar discipline in the way he stood that made Piper's chest do something complicated. "Sir," said Clem, diplomatic as always, "we're going to need to do an intake exam. When the vet gets here, the vet can examine him." The man, she could see a faded tattoo on his forearm, a unit crest of some kind, didn't look at Clem. He was scanning the room the same way the dog was. Nobody else puts their hands on him until then. Are we clear? Clem looked at Piper again. Piper set down her pen. She walked to the counter, not toward them, just positioned herself where she could see the dog more clearly. The man noticed. His eyes moved to her the way a security camera moves tracking a new variable. He took her in the slight frame, the teal scrubs, the hair pulled back in a loose knot because it was almost midnight and she'd been on since 3, and something in his expression settled into a kind of dismissal. Not mean. Just certain. She wasn't a threat. She wasn't a factor. He filed her away and looked back at the door. "What happened to him?" she asked, not loudly, just asked it. "Car. In the parking lot of my building. He went under the front wheel." He said it factually. The flatness of it was its own kind of wound. "He doesn't need your sympathy. He needs a doctor." "He needs both," Piper said. "Dr. Vega is on her way in. She'll be about 12 minutes." She paused. "He's losing blood from somewhere in the ribcage. You can see it in the fur. I need to at least apply pressure until." I said no. The word was a door closing, final. A couple of people in the waiting room, a woman with a cat carrier, an older man with a collie on his lap, went quiet. The man with the Malinois held the leash and stared at Piper with a patience that was really just another form of contempt. He expected her to nod, to back up, to go do something else. She looked at the dog instead. The Malinois was watching her, not the way a suspicious dog watches, that low, fixed, evaluating stare, but with something else. His head had tilted a fraction. His ears were fully up now. She couldn't explain why that mattered, but it did. She took one step toward them. "Ma'am." The man's voice dropped an octave. "I am going to say this one more time." "Rustig," Piper said quietly. She said it the way she had learned to say it 6 years ago in a kennel at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, where the humidity sat on everything like a wet blanket and the dogs were trained to a standard that most civilians never saw. She said it with the hand signal she had modified specifically for noise-sensitive animals, left palm open, fingers spread, a slow rotation inward rather than the standard flat press. It wasn't in any manual. She'd invented it one afternoon for a particular dog who flinched at sudden movements and needed something softer. The Malinois sat down. Not gradually, not reluctantly. He sat the way a trained dog sits when the right person gives the right command. Immediate, clean, complete. His injured leg trembled with the adjustment, but he held position and looked at Piper with an attention so focused it felt like a held breath. The man with the leash went completely still. Piper kept her eyes on the dog. She moved another step closer, slowly, letting him read her body language. "Rustig," she said again, softer. She crouched to his level. "What?" The man's voice had lost its edge. He sounded like someone who had just miscounted stairs in the dark. "What did you just do?" "He knows that command," Piper said. "And that hand signal, it's not standard." She looked up at the man then. "I modified it. I only ever used it with one dog." The man stared at her. Piper reached out her hand, palm up, and waited. She didn't move it toward the dog, just offered it. The Malinois, she was almost certain now, lowered his nose and pressed it into her palm. The leash went slack. His name was Reese Holden, Captain Army, retired 2 years prior. He told her this later, in the narrow hallway outside the exam room where Dr. Vega was working on the dog's ribs. 2 cracked, 1 laceration deep enough to need closing, left rear leg bruised but not broken, a lot of blood from a scalp wound that looked worse than it was. He told her with his arms crossed and his jaw tight, and the posture of a man who was angry at himself for having no idea what had just happened. "You worked with MWDs," he said. It wasn't a question. 3 years, Fort Campbell. I was contracted through a civilian veterinary firm that serviced the unit's working dog program. She leaned against the wall with her own arms crossed, not mirroring him, just finding a place to be while they both processed the last hour. I left in 2021. Why? She'd been asked that before. She'd given a lot of different answers depending on who was asking and what she owed them. She looked at Holden for a moment, the gray in his temples, the set of his shoulders, the way he was working very hard not to show that he was shaken, and decided on the truth. "I refused to clear a dog for redeployment," she said. "He'd been through a forward operating base attack where his handler was killed. I ran the behavioral assessments. I wrote up my findings. I said the dog was showing indicators of chronic stress response that made him psychologically unsuitable for return to active duty. I recommended retirement and rehoming." She paused. A senior officer disagreed. "I was told to revise my assessment. I didn't. They canceled my contract." Holden was quiet for a long moment. Down the hall, she could hear Dr. Vega speaking in low, steady tones to her assistant. "What was the dog's designation?" he said. "MWD Force 7 Kilo. His working name was Arlo." She watched it move through him. She'd gotten good at watching things move through people. She'd worked nights long enough to know the difference between the moment before someone understood and the moment after. This was the after. His jaw did something. His arms dropped to his sides. "They told me he was fully cleared," Holden said. "When they assigned him to me, they said he'd been evaluated and cleared." "I know what they told you." He stopped, started again. "He doesn't like loud noises. He doesn't sleep through the night. He startles. I thought that was just how he was." "It's how he's been," Piper said carefully, "since Kandahar." Holden put one hand against the wall and looked at the floor for a while. She let him. She'd learned that too, when to talk and when to just be in the room with someone while they rearranged something inside themselves. "He chose you," Holden said finally. He didn't look up when he said it, right there in the waiting room, in front of everyone. He remembered me." She said it simply. "I spent 60 hours doing behavioral work with him over about 3 months. Dogs have better memory than people give them credit for, especially working dogs, and especially for people who were patient with them when they were scared. You sat with him." It wasn't a question this time either, more like something arriving. "A lot of evenings," Piper said, after everyone else went home. She thought about those evenings now while she waited for Dr. Vega to finish. She thought about the specific quality of light in that kennel at dusk, the way it went gold, and then amber, and then nothing. And how she'd sit outside Arlo's run with her back against the chain link and talk to him in a low voice about things that didn't matter. What she'd had for lunch, what she was reading, what her mother's yard looked like in fall. He would pace at first. He always paced. And then he'd stop pacing and sit near the fence on his side of the wire, and she'd sit on hers, and eventually his breathing would slow. She hadn't known then that she was losing the fight. By the time the senior officer had called her in and told her that her assessment was not aligned with the program's operational requirements, she had already documented 7 weeks of evidence. She had photographs, behavioral charts, cortisol readings. She had written a 30-page report that she was certain couldn't be dismissed. It had been dismissed. She'd driven out of Fort Campbell for the last time on a Wednesday afternoon in March, and she'd told herself she'd done what she could do, and she'd cried for about 20 miles on the highway, and then she'd gotten herself together because falling apart on the interstate is how you end up in a ditch, and she'd driven the rest of the way home to Tennessee. She'd thought about Arlo a lot in the 2 years after that. She'd wondered where he ended up. She'd told herself he was probably fine. She'd done a decent job of believing it on most days. And then he'd come through the door of a clinic in Virginia on a Tuesday night, bleeding and limping, holding himself together with a discipline that was almost heartbreaking. Still working, still assessing, still doing the job even when his body was failing. And she'd looked at that notched left ear, the one she'd noted specifically in report number 6. And something in her chest had cracked open like a window in a room that had been sealed shut for too long. She was updating the intake form when Holden came back out. He'd gone to the parking lot for a few minutes. She hadn't asked why. She'd figured he needed air. When he came back in, his eyes were red at the corners, but the rest of him was composed in a way that suggested he'd worked hard at it. He sat in the chair across from the counter, not aggressive now, just tired, looking like any owner at any late-night animal hospital, worn out and scared and trying not to show the scared part. "I was wrong," he said, "the way I came in here." Piper looked up from the form. "I do that." He said it evenly, looking at the floor. "I get protective, and I come in with the assumption that nobody's going to know as much as I do about him or handle it as well. And I've been right enough times that I stopped questioning it." He was quiet for a beat. "Tonight I was wrong." "You were scared for him," Piper said. "That's not an excuse." "No," she agreed, "but it's a reason." He looked at her then. The full look, not the dismissal from the waiting room. Taking her in like he was actually trying to see her, she held it steady. "Why didn't you just back down?" he said. "Most people would have." Piper thought about it honestly. "Because he was bleeding," she said, "and because—" She stopped and then kept going. "Because I already fought for him once. I wasn't going to walk away from him twice." Holden was quiet for a long moment. 30 pages, he said. "More or less." "And they just—" "Yes." He exhaled, long and slow, and she could hear the weight in it. "I'm sorry," he said. "That happened to you." She blinked. That wasn't what she'd expected. She'd expected him to be sorry for his own behavior, or for the systems, or to say something that was really about himself dressed up as an apology to her. Not this, not that specific. "Thank you," she said, and meant it. Dr. Vega came out at 1:17 in the morning and said that Arlo was stable, sutured, and on fluids, that the rib situation was manageable with rest and anti-inflammatories, that the leg was bruised and would need time but would heal cleanly, that he could be moved in a few hours if his vitals held, or they could keep him overnight for observation, and that was Holden's call. Holden said overnight without hesitating. Dr. Vega nodded, said she'd have someone set up a comfortable space, and went back in. Holden stayed in the chair. Piper went back to her charts. The waiting room had emptied out by then. The woman with the cat, the man with the collie, all gone. Just the two of them in the night. "Can I ask you something?" Holden said. She turned. The hand signal, the modified one. He was looking at his hands. "Did you teach it to anyone else? Is it something that got passed on through the program after you left?" "No," Piper said. "I left before I could teach it to anyone, and I only ever used it with him." Holden nodded slowly. She could see him working through the math of it. The only person who ever used that signal, the dog who responded to it 6 years later in a clinic waiting room in Virginia at midnight. So the reason he responded is that he remembered me, specifically. He sat with that for a while. She let him. After a few minutes, he said, "I got him 3 months after they cleared him. He was difficult at first, wouldn't engage with me. Slept against the door like he was waiting for something. I thought I'd done something wrong. I read every resource I could find, hired a trainer, took 6 months before he started coming to me in the mornings." Piper listened. "He's good now," Holden said. "He's mine, but there's always something a little held back, something I couldn't get to, no matter what I did." He looked up. "I thought that was me. I thought I'd just never quite reached him all the way." He paused. "Tonight I watched him reach someone else." "That held back part," she said carefully, "that's not about you. That was already there when they handed him over. That's what I was trying to tell them." She kept her voice level, not pointed, just honest. "He gave you what he was able to give. He trusts you. Tonight he was in pain and panicking, and he still held his position in that waiting room because you were holding his leash. That's not nothing, Captain. That's 6 months of work that you put in, and he put in, and it held when it needed to. Holden's jaw worked. He looked at the exam room door. He just ran toward me when it happened, he said. In the parking lot. He was under the car and then he was just running toward me. Limping, running. He made a sound that might have been something else trying to get out and decided against it. I didn't know where to take him. I just drove. You got here, Piper said. That's what mattered. They moved Arlo to the recovery room at 2 in the morning. Piper had another hour on her shift. She checked in twice, just standard vitals checks, just what the protocol called for. She told herself that. The second time she went in, Holden was sitting on the floor beside the padded mat where Arlo lay, one hand resting lightly on the dog's flank, not moving, just present. Arlo was breathing slow and even, deep in medicated sleep. Holden looked up when Piper came in. He didn't say anything. She checked the vitals, wrote them down, looked at the dog for a moment. Arlo's eyes opened, just partway. The soft, heavy half-open of an animal sedated and warm and not in pain. He looked at Piper. His tail moved once, a single slow wag against the mat. She crouched down and put her hand near his nose, palm up, the way she'd done in the waiting room. He pressed into it again. Lighter now, more gentle. Not the desperate press of an animal in crisis, but the easy press of a dog who knows where he is and is fine with it. She stayed like that for a moment, her hand against his nose, and tried not to feel too much about the years between Fort Campbell and now, or the 30 pages, or the March afternoon on the interstate, or any of it. It didn't entirely work. But she stayed steady. She stood, wrote the last note in the chart, and moved toward the door. Piper. She turned. Holden was still on the floor, hand on the dog's flank. Thank you, he said, for not backing down. She nodded once. He picked right, Holden added, quietly, without performance, just saying a thing that was true. She walked back to the station and sat down and finished her charts. Outside, the parking lot was empty and lit by a single orange lamp, and somewhere across town a truck and engine ran and faded, and the night went back to quiet. At 3 in the morning, she got a cup of coffee from the machine and drank it standing up, looking at nothing, just resting in the ordinary size of the moment. At shift change, she went back in to write the morning handoff note. Arlo was still on the mat, still sleeping, but his head had shifted in the night, angled toward the door, toward the direction she usually came from. Clem, arriving for the day shift, leaned over her shoulder and looked at the dog. That the one from last night? The guy who came in yelling? He wasn't yelling, Piper said. Sure seemed like it. She thought about the waiting room, the leash, the look on Holden's face when he'd first seen her, that practiced default of someone who'd stopped expecting to be wrong about things. The moment Arlo sat down, the way Holden's arms had dropped to his sides. He was scared, she said. He just hadn't figured that out yet. Clem shrugged and went to make coffee. Piper finished the handoff note and snapped the chart closed and picked up her bag. Arlo's ear twitched in his sleep, some dream moving through him, chase or field or open ground, somewhere he was running without injury, without the weight of all the history that had accumulated across 6 years of working life. She hoped it was that. She'd always liked to think that dogs dreamed well when they finally felt safe. She hadn't been able to save him from what came before. She'd tried and it hadn't been enough, and she'd carried that for a long time in the specific way you carry things you couldn't prevent. Not with guilt exactly, more with a low, constant awareness. A knowing that sat in the back of the chest and didn't go anywhere. But she'd been here tonight when he needed her. She'd held her ground in a lit waiting room at 11:47 on a Tuesday night, and she'd said the word, and he'd remembered, and maybe that was the version of the story that mattered most. Not the 30 pages and the lost contract and the March highway, this version. The one where she walked through the right door at the right time, and he was alive, and she knew exactly what to say. Dogs don't choose wrong. She'd believed that for as long as she'd been doing this work, they can be confused, frightened, shut down by what people do to them over the years. But when they choose freely, Without pressure, without command, the way Arlo had chosen in that waiting room, pressing his whole weight into her open palm while his owner stood there, holding a slack leash, and trying to understand what he was seeing. They choose true. Every time. She pushed through the front door into the cold morning air and walked to her car. Behind her in the quiet recovery room, Arlo slept on.